All righty, so we are back in Romans 1. Maybe we'll finish Romans 1 today. That's the goal. We'll see. Last week we wrapped up, or started the wrap up, let's say it that way, a section of his warm-up round on wrath. Kind of a whirlwind from there. So what he's doing, writing to the Roman church, and so in Rome you're going to have Gentile believers and Jewish believers. It's believed that the Roman church got started because Jews who were in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost took the message that they received there back with them to Rome, and so that's how those churches got started. So you're looking at, in Rome, a really multi-ethnic kind of church. All right, and so where Paul is starting is he's using Jewish language and talking about Gentiles. So basically, he's an equal opportunity gospelizer at this point, if you will, where he's bringing all of this together. And what we spent a lot of time with last week is that idea of being without God or rejecting God, ungodded, as we talked about at one point. So what we want to do is kind of finish that conversation this morning and wrap up his opening salvo here as we kind of move into chapter 2, which then will pivot from wrath to righteous judgment. And so Paul's going to show us both sides of the coin. So let's go ahead and start beginning in verse 19. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. So what he's doing, or what it looks like he's doing at least, is he's really sticking it to the Gentile audience here, because he's saying that, okay, let's bring some of this stuff together that we know about the Bible. Jews know something about God because they're God's chosen people, and God has revealed himself to the Jews through prophets and through the Exodus and through all of that stuff. So Jews have a relationship with God that extends beyond the natural world. Gentiles don't necessarily have those kinds of experiences, but what Paul is saying is you can look around, you can look outside, you can see a world, and that's all you need to know that there is a God. Now, a creator God at that. Y'all might remember from several months ago, we talked about general revelation and special revelation. And so general revelation is the created world around you as a revelation of God. So what Paul is saying is you don't need special revelation to understand that God exists, right? You can look out in the world and you can see that. What the Gentiles have done, the pagan Gentiles have done, is they have rejected general revelation in favor of pagan gods and idols and all of that. Now, in some ways, he's sticking it to the Gentiles there, but he's also speaking more specifically about the corruption of the human heart. And the way that he's going to get about that is through this idea. I don't want to say idea, but through this really kind of pointed irritation at idols. That's kind of where he's going to go. And how do you get to an idol? Like, okay, there's general revelation, there's God, but you kind of reject general revelation. So how do you go from rejecting general revelation to an idol? Well, it's pretty easy. If you get rid of God, you got to replace him with something, right? People are spiritual. People are created as spiritual beings. We're going to worship something. We're going to let something guide our lives. There's no such thing, even if it's ourselves, right? We're still worshiping ourselves. We're still worshiping our desires, whatever it is. Something is going to fill the gap. So what Paul is getting at, yeah, he's kind of sticking it to the Gentiles in terms of idol worship and paganism and all of that, but the human heart most fundamentally and radically needs repair because it's the heart that is central to the experience of grace and salvation. Whether you're Jewish, whether you're Gentile, doesn't matter. And it's a heart issue that chooses to reject God or chooses to go out without his presence. So if you reject the abundant evidence of God in the world, then what are you going to put in its place? And Paul says that's what leads to idolatry. That's how you get there. I want to give you a quote. One of the few times I'll ever quote John Calvin, but I'll quote John Calvin this morning. He said in his Institutes of the Christian Religion, which is a massive, like several volume thing, but he says that there exists in the human minds and indeed by natural instinct some sense of deity we hold to be beyond dispute, since God himself, to prevent any man from pretending ignorance, has endued all men with some idea of his Godhead, the memory of which he constantly renews and occasionally enlarges, that all to a man being aware that there is a God and that he is their maker may be condemned by their own conscience when they neither worship him nor consecrate their lives to his service. So Calvin is much like Paul. He likes these really, really long sentences. The short version of that is, we know that there is a God. God has given us a sense of his presence so that he can then hold us accountable for whether or not we choose to believe. All right. He says, even idolatry is ample evidence of this fact, for we know how reluctant man is to lower himself in order to set other creatures above him. So there, what does it take for me to decide I'm going to worship a stone statue? Like, what headspace do I have to be in to make that decision? Because I like to be at the top of the heap as a human. So if I make the decision that I'm going to worship something of stone, that comes from a place of needing to worship, right? Knowing that there should be a God in my life and creating one. Go ahead.
No, like, I've always heard,
Yeah.
what about the people that never hear?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, according to Paul, everybody knows.
Right.
Yeah. Well, they already have, because the world's created around them. Now, what Paul will say, and I think this may be where there's a little bit of daylight on that, is everybody should know that there is a creator God. General revelation isn't enough to get you to Jesus. All right, you still need the special revelation to get there. And so that probably would be the response. What are they waiting to hear? It's not God, it's Jesus, if that makes sense. So, last thing he says, the human heart is a perpetual factory of idols. We're really good at creating stuff to worship. And you know, I like, there's an old school translation. Calvin was writing in French, by the way. And there's an old school translation of Calvin that says a continual forge of idols, which I almost like better, because it's sort of like we will work really, really hard to create more idols instead of just accepting God and accepting Christ in that way. So if you look at Romans 23, when you see Paul writing about, 123 rather, when you see Paul writing about the exchange, that people exchange the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things, that exchange, he's following in the thought tradition of the psalmist. So Psalm 106:20, talking about the Exodus ordeal, the golden calf, they exchanged the glory of God for the image of an ox that eats grass. And when you put it like that, it seems kind of dumb. I mean, here Moses is up on the mountain trying to talk to Yahweh, and we get a little impatient. So what are we going to do? Make a cow. Think about it like that. Like this is who we are, and we want something we can see. What about Jeremiah? Has a nation changed its gods even though they are no gods? But my people have changed their glory for that which does not profit. They have created substitutes for God's glory, and then they have turned around and given glory, which means they have worshiped those idols rather than God. So the result is that they lack the glory of God in their lives because they have chosen to abandon God and effectively ask Him to leave us alone. I mean, here's the deal. Like, you can't decide, and maybe this one will hit close to home for us as Americans. You can't decide that, I could go about 3 ways and get in trouble either which way I'll go, but let's just stick to this one. You can't decide that money is going to be the guiding force of your life and then walk into church on Sunday morning and expect to get God's blessings. Either God's calling the shots or the economy's calling the shots. All right, we just came out of an election season. Let me dig my hole a little deeper. You can't decide that Trump is going to lead the way in your life. You've either got to decide that Trump is God's man, yes, but he's human and he will mess up, and therefore we need to not follow him because he's the created, and instead follow the Creator who put him there. But what do we do a lot of the times? What did I do first thing this morning when I woke up? Walk in the living room, turn on the news. What has he done? That's everybody's question now. What has he done? Right. Where is Elon and what has Trump done? That's But I mean, it's we don't even realize we're doing it. Is my point. It's so easy to slip off into something else. Do it. It's like, it's a routine. I mean, you and part of that, I think, is owed to the fact that as a culture, we have deprioritized church. Like, for some generations, ours didn't get it, but for some generations, you go to church just about every night of the week for something. Choir practice, Bible study, church league, baseball, softball, whatever, dinner on the grounds. I mean, you went to church and you stayed at church all the time. Now we talk about having one service a week. Well, what's going to fill its place? Something else, right? And I'm not saying you got to come to, like, the church is the end-all, be-all. Church is composed of people, too. Church will mess you up if it's got you get in with the wrong people. But it does signal a shift in priority, I think. So, I use big-ticket issues, but let's also just think about ourselves for a minute. Our own desires. That's what Paul's going to talk about in just a minute. It's what do I want to do? Who do I want to be? What do I want my life to look like? That is what I'm going to focus on and prioritize because, dadgummit, it's my life. No, it's not. Sorry. What is it that Paul says? Everything that I have is as filthy rags before the throne of an almighty God. But we're not that humble. Ours is great and wonderful. It can be ourselves, it can be our desires, it can be another person, it can be an entity, it can be a cause. And causes are real dangerous, right? So are maybe politician-type people. Because you can become convinced that you are serving God by dedicating your life to this thing, this person or this cause or what. I mean, you see it all over the news. There I go again. What are they out protesting about today? Isms, the isms, feminism, I don't know, I'm running out of isms, communism, socialism, capitalism, ism, this and that and the other. That all can become your God if you're not careful. And it won't even be intentional. So, what does Paul say happens then? Therefore, God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. Yeah. So, you'll notice that what Paul has done now is he has described for us the transition from idolatry to immorality. And the phrase that he uses to do that, the signal phrase for us, might catch us a little bit off guard. God gave them up. 24. God gave them up. 26. And when we get to 28, God gave them up. That's this. What does he do? He gives them up to their enemies, right? That's why they wind up in exile, or why they wind up like the Israelites in Egypt, right? They're enslaved and they're in servitude and so forth and so on. He gives them up to their desires. We want a king, we want a king, we want a king. God says, no, you don't really want a king, because when you get a king, you're going to be like everybody else. Israelites, yeah, that's the point. We want a king like everybody else. Okay, fine, here's Saul. Good luck. I mean, if you get in God's way enough, he'll let you have it. Good luck, but he'll let you have it. Paul is not placing the blame on God for human sin. Notice the way that he does this. People did X, Y, and Z, therefore God gave them up. Not to use the old preacher joke, but kind of what is the therefore? This equals that. People did this, so God gave them up to it. Fine. So Paul's maintaining that when we insist in our own way, God allows human folly to run its natural course without preventing its consequences. And at the heart of it, when we persist in willful disobedience, what we are really saying is we want freedom from God. Freedom from God and freedom from God's expectations. So, he gives it to us. The way that Paul describes all of this is the consequences of divine wrath. And I think it's really interesting that basically God's version of divine wrath in these terms is let them get a taste of it. Right? It's not as though God is going out of his way to actively make it worse. He's literally just letting stuff run its natural course and pulling the stoppers out of the way. Okay. We'll use the king for an example. You want a king? Fine. Here are the things that come along with having a king. Your taxes are going to go up because you've got to fund the king's armies. You've got to fund the king's concubines. You've got to do this. You've got to do that. Kings get full of themselves and they get big heads and big egos. And then they're going to raise taxes and do all of that even more because they're the king and they can. But okay, fine, you want that. Like, he gives them the laundry list. This is why you don't want a king. And what do? No, we'd like one. We would like to have the structure that everybody else has. Okay, fine. What happens when Saul becomes king? Taxes go up, everything gets real rough and real hard real quick. Right? Now, that is not an endorsement of Republican economic policies necessarily. It's not a lack of endorsement either. But what I'm saying is there are warnings, and we miss the warnings because we want it too much. We want it too badly. God doesn't force us to be devoted to him, nor does he force us to be good to our neighbor. So when we choose not to be, we can get ready for the unhappy results. So, then we get to the section that I think is probably the most overused in the Bible in our current culture. I'm really walking a tightrope this morning, I think. Verses 26 and 27. I'm going to read them again just because. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. Those of us on the evangelical right really like to throw these verses at the LGBTQ crowd. We like Leviticus, and then we really like Paul in Romans 1. Okay, we think that's going to do some good. It's not, because we've actually missed part of the point ourselves. This is not God singling out homosexuality as worse than any other sin. I'm not defending the LGBTQIA, B, C, D, E, F, G, whatever agenda, but I'm also not thinking that God inspired Paul to write this so that 21st century Christians would have a theological and cultural battering ram. Okay, that's not what I think is happening here. Because look at the flow of the argument in that whole section. The exchange of truth about God leads to the exchange of truth about God's creatures, including fellow humans. So, out of control sexual activity, in whatever form it takes, is both idolatry and injustice and unrighteousness in which the whole person participates. It's low-hanging fruit. You've got your whole body, your whole heart, and your whole mind wrapped up in out-of-control sexual activity. All right? It's easy. It's an easy example for Paul to use. That's part one, I think. Secondly, the gospel is intended to repair human sexual sin and any other sin by replacing misguided worship with true worship that is offered by the whole person. So, what does the Bible tell us? You're to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But if you take something like human sexual sin, what is that? Heart, soul, mind, and strength. Okay? So, it's misguided worship. And, worship does not have to mean that we're singing songs to it and bowing down. Worship is active participation and willingness to let whatever that is guide our lives. So one specific result he outlines here of the idolatry of sexual passion was that natural relations are replaced with unnatural, or as the ESV has it, those which are contrary to nature. So in Greek, in the original Greek, that roughly means contrary to the structure of created reality. Okay, what is the structure of created reality, Ian? I'm so glad you asked. Genesis 1. He created them male and female. Fast forward into Genesis. A man shall leave his mother and wife and cleave unto mother and father and cleave unto his wife. Jewish. Because Jesus is Jewish. This is one of those areas where we have got to get over the fact that there is some distinction between Jews and Christians in belief. Yes, but what does Christianity do? Build off of the Jewish foundation. It never says that's bad, get rid of it. It says, here's the Jewish foundation, here's Jesus, here's all of that reimagined. And notice that Jesus never does away with the ethics of Judaism. Go to the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard it said this. I say to you this, and it's always bigger. It's always more comprehensive when Jesus gets done with it than it was when he picked it up from the Jewish background, right? So in the case of Paul, I'm going to give you one example, a guy by the name of E.P. Sanders. Sanders is a big gun on thinking about Paul. He got started in 1977, and he's still writing and publishing. This is 2015. So Sanders says, Romans 1 is a completely unambiguous condemnation of all homosexual activity because Paul was a first-century Jew, and on ethical questions he ordinarily followed Jewish views precisely. More particularly, he was a diaspora, that is a non-Palestinian Jew, and therefore likely to be even more rigid on sexual ethics, because such Jews made sexual immorality and especially homosexual activity a major distinction between them and Gentiles. So what is something that characterizes Gentiles? Why? Okay, back this up just a minute. When they go into Canaan, when Joshua leads them into Canaan, what does God tell them not to do? Intermarry with the pagan women. Why? Because you're bringing in pagan idol worship, and you're bringing in a pagan life ethic, which includes a sexual ethic. Don't violate that, right? It's not a race thing. I get tired of people saying that. It's not a race thing. It's a culture thing. All right? Fast forward a few thousand years, the Jews are still thinking that way. What separates us from them is we live right. We have a set of law that we follow that was given to us by God that governs how we live. Remember what Paul says about himself, and I think it's Philippians, I could be wrong. As to the law, he is blameless, which means he's kept it, number one. Number two, he knows it. So when Paul comes to think about, okay, what is the best example I can come up with of this transformation from this transition from idolatry to immorality, what is the most obvious thing? Sexual immorality. A misguided sexual ethic, because it's comprehensive. It occupies mind, soul, and body. And it is also already a distinction that Jews are familiar with in terms of that makes them a Gentile and this makes us a Jew. So it really is like a long-form example, and this is why I say that to you. Look at the last 4 verses of chapter 1. Since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up, there it is again, to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of, get ready and hold on, unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Now, we've all heard hell's fire and brimstone preachers before. Can you imagine, not that he was doing it because he was writing this letter, but can you imagine a preacher getting in front of you full of venom and fury and reading that list off to you? So what's Paul saying? Is the sexual sin any worse? No. Just as idolatry leads to sexual immorality, what else does God give them up to? A debased mind which does 20 things. I mean, that's a list of 20, if you weren't counting. So, why do I say that those previous verses are overused? Because they are. Christians have got to get over the fact that, we have a clear sexual ethic and therefore we have a drum to beat in the public square. We got to clean up our own house first. And cleaning up our own house means dealing with these problems in our congregations, in our pews, and in our leadership. Oops. I mean, that's not a popular thing to say, and I feel like I am preaching this morning, sorry. But, I mean, far be it from me to say that I'm immune to any of that. That's not what this is. But you got to recognize it. You got to work against it. You can't let this stuff govern who you are. Because how does this reflect the image of God? It doesn't. I mean, that last list right there, foolish, faithless, beginning with disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, and ruthless. I'm going to come back to 32 in just a minute. In the Greek, all of those words begin with that Greek prefix a, the letter A, which remember from last week means un. So how we really ought to think about that is unobedient to parents, unsound, untrustworthy, uncaring, unmerciful. And then Paul doesn't have to say they exchanged good for evil. They exchanged peace for strife. They exchanged honesty for deceit, because it's built in. All right, this is all still on that exchange business. We took the things that are positive and exchanged them for the things that were negative. Why? Because we got our worship upside down. So that's what's at the heart of the human condition for Paul, is that we've exchanged for the wrong thing. So what's the message of verse 32? Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. Cultural Christianity at its finest. We refuse to call out any of it. This is not about the big, what we would think of as the big ticket issues, like, yes, adultery is a problem. Yes, homosexuality is a problem. Yes, pathological liars are a problem. Okay. But if you're running around after church talking about what's going on in so-and-so's life, are you any better? No. And, Baptists, we like to get around that. We all need to be praying for so-and-so. Okay, I guess. No, y'all need to be praying for so-and-so. And then if so-and-so wants to tell it, it's so-and-so's to tell. Faithfulness versus faithlessness. We like to think about that in terms of church attendance. We hadn't seen them in a while, they must have fallen out. Not necessarily. You can sit in the pew every Sunday of your life and then be sitting on the fast track to hell. I mean, what does faithfulness look like? Not just church attendance. What does wisdom look like? Uh-oh. He's 27. He doesn't need to talk about wisdom. You're right, and I'm not. Y'all figure it out. Honesty for deceit. Do we lay it all out there, or do we hold some stuff back? Do we condition the way that people think about us based on the things that we don't tell them? Or the things we don't reveal about ourselves versus the things that we... it is... Humans will put in a lot of work to get around God's righteous decree. And then what Paul will say following that is, people will put in work to get around it, and then other people will applaud them for it. And in the NRSV, instead of saying give approval, it says give applause. So it's not just behind a closed door that we're giving approval, it's very public. Good for you. So in the situation of moral chaos, which is since the fall where we've been, people's willful disobedience and the applause for it, the wrath of God is experienced not just at Judgment Day, but now. He gives us over to our desires. He gives us over to our folly. He gives us over to insert sin here. Now, last controversial thing that I will say today. Having been born and raised, I say born and raised, that's not quite fair. Having been born into a Baptist family, let's say it that way. You hear, not necessarily from mom and dad, but you hear out of Baptist pulpits this idea of a reprobate mind or a reprobate heart, that God will deal with you for so long, and then after that he's going to put you on the shelf and consign you to hell. That is not biblical. Because the message of the gospel is we need someone to save us from ourselves. And we need someone to undo the exchange, the wrong-headed exchange. And even though God has handed people over to their own passions and to their evil minds, he has also, interesting, same word, handed over his Son for our redemption. And I'm sorry, but I don't find a sin in the Bible that's more powerful than Jesus. I go back to, who is hell for? The unbelievers. Who is heaven for? The believing sinners. All right. All right, I'm done a few minutes early, but questions or comments? If I keep talking, I'll ruin next week, so we'll stop. All right. If not, Brother Tommy, you're the last one in, so pray us out.